You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. I'm your host, as usual, Ankit Panda, broadcasting from Washington, D.C. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Sean Carberry, a former correspondent for NPR in Kabul, among other things. He's currently a foreign policy writer and analyst. And Sean actually wrote a story for us in The Diplomat on Afghanistan's future way back in 2015. That was an interesting time because, as some of our listeners might recall, it was at the end of 2014 that the United States declared an end to combat operations in Afghanistan, of course, maintaining a presence in the country for limited counterterrorism reasons and to advise and assist the Afghan National Forces as well. So, Sean, I want to welcome you to the show. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, I think this is, first of all, I think it's the first time I've had a former NPR reporter on the show. So that is a little exciting, given how much I personally, enjoy the the NPR experience. So thanks for that.
Sure.
I do want to ask you a little bit before we get into the discussion today regarding the future of Afghanistan, the U.S. withdrawal that the Biden administration announced in mid-April, and so forth. Just to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, can you begin by just telling us a little bit about your time in Afghanistan, the kinds of things you saw, what you reported on?
Sure. And, when I was there, it was definitely an interesting time and time of transition. I went in basically the summer of 2012 and was there until the end of 2014. And, as people may recall, the end of 2014 was the end of the International Security Assistance Force era, the ISAF era of combat operations. And so, technically on January 1st, 2015, the new mission began, Resolute Support, which was focused on training and advising Afghan forces. So leading up to the end of 2014, the couple years was all about transitioning security responsibility to Afghan security forces. So the U.S. and partner forces were gradually drawing down at that time. They were handing over bases and trying to push the Afghan forces more and more out on the lead for combat operations. So that was sort of the big picture on the security side of what was happening. And then while I was there, the 2014 presidential election took place, which was a sort of a long-running drama over the course
Right.
of 2014. I mean, the first round of elections was in April, and it wasn't until the very end of September that they inaugurated Ashraf Ghani as the president. So that was sort of again, over the course of the summer of 2014, just really taking up all of the press's time in Kabul, because every day there was a new wrinkle. There was an estimated result, and then Abdullah would typically object to it, and then basically indicate that he was going to withdraw from the process and form his own government. So it was a really rocky period. So, again, my time in Afghanistan on the ground was really through this process of this sort of transition from what had happened just before I got there, which was the surge and the peak of troop presence and this effort to really beat back the Taliban and then transition things over to Afghan forces. And, then as you alluded to, January of 2015, I wrote a piece for the Diplomat, sort of looking at where things were as a result of that transition. And just to wrap up based on your question, I ended up in the summer of 2017 going to work for the Defense Department Office of Inspector General as, at that time, the lead writer of their quarterly report on Afghanistan, Operation Freedom Sentinel, under a construct called the Lead Inspector General. So we partnered with the State Department and USAID offices of Inspector General to issue these quarterly reports. And so I was lead writer of that for a year, so continuing to focus on Afghanistan on a daily basis, and then became the managing editor of all of the Lead Inspector General reports. So was still on a daily basis dealing with Afghanistan up until March of this year when I left the government, and have been looking at things on my own, and in a position where I'm able to speak a little bit more freely and candidly about Afghanistan than I could as a journalist or as a government employee.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I can't imagine a better guest actually to reflect on the last 6.5 years or so since the end of combat operations, looking at what lies ahead for the country. I actually appreciated that you mentioned the 2014 election, because I remember quite vividly a friend of mine was actually an election observer on the ground, and I asked him to pen his impressions for The Diplomat. And at the time, of course, things became very drawn out, and I recall, I think I ended up editing around 6,000 words of just very detailed election observer commentary from around the country. And really, I mean, when we look at the political future of Afghanistan, the uncertainty ahead, the sort of lack of unity, I mean, a lot of it goes back to that national unity government brokered by John Kerry. I remember him sort of flying in and sort of brokering that deal at the time. But anyways, I mean, here we are in 2021. The Biden administration, of course, has announced that U.S. troops will withdraw by September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. A questionable sort of deadline for withdrawal, if you ask my opinion. But I want to sort of get a sense, from where you're sitting and the experience that you've had. So tell us a bit, I mean, first of all, what's really happened in Afghanistan, I mean, on the ground between 2014 and now? I mean, I know this is a really high-level kind of big-picture question, and we've sort of seen territorial gains against the Taliban, that's kind of waxed and waned. We've seen, of course, the Inspector General reports that haven't painted a very rosy picture on everything from corruption to civilian casualties. What's the story that, you sort of tell yourself and tell others about what's really happened in Afghanistan since the United States drew down in 2014? Or at the end of combat operations?
So I look at it kind of in the lens of the way I framed it, frankly, in January of 2015 when that transition happened. And at the time, there was a lot of sort of celebration of that moment. And General Campbell, who at the time was the commander, talking about all of the great progress and that the irreversible gains and things like that. And, he was sort of looking at from 2001 to that moment, how things had improved in Afghanistan, which was true. But I felt it was not quite the right measure, because really the peak of things was around 2011 and 12 with the height of the surge in international investment in Afghanistan. And from that time over the transition period to the end of 2014, things were kind of in a bit of a slow decline as investments decreased in health sector and education. Some things were sliding backwards. So that to me kind of set up this image of really basically a tire with a small hole in it. And if you pump air into it fast enough, it'll stay inflated. But as you dial back the rate that you're pumping into it, eventually the tire is going to start to flatten. And that's kind of the image to me of Afghanistan in some ways, really since 2011 or so, is that the air is coming out and it's settling. And the question is, where is that, that baseline, that landing point of what the country can essentially be, largely on its own. And so that's how I've watched it, is to kind of see that movement. And certainly, in 2015 and 2016, it was kind of a stalemate in the security arena. As you mentioned, there was some back and forth, there was some gains and losses. But, really over the last few years, it's been a fairly steady trajectory of the Taliban gaining on the security front. Even though the Afghan forces are larger in number, better equipped, they still have not been able to hold a lot of terrain, especially in rural areas. And, it's understandable against an insurgency that, they're going to move around where there is freedom of movement and where the government isn't, and use those areas to prepare en masse and and then start to encroach on urban areas, which is what's been going on. So even though Afghan security forces have improved as a force over the last 3-4 years or so, they still have not been able to contain or defeat the Taliban. So I think that's one dimension. Is the security front has been, again, that tire has been flattening a little bit.
Right.
Politically, it has been, really kind of another stagnant situation since the unity government. That, as a lot of people, I think, predicted at the time, it was something where it was an artificial construct designed to solve a problem, which was a disputed election that neither party wanted to basically say that they lost. And they each had people with guns behind them who were willing to fight for that. So an awkward situation was brokered where there was some power sharing, and then it took them months to agree on a cabinet. They were supposed to then enact elections reforms to improve future elections. That really didn't go anywhere, and so you had parliamentary elections that were delayed for several years. The presidential election in 2019 was pushed back a little bit and once again took a long time to come to resolution and kind of ended up back in the same place. So really, politically, the country has been heavily treading water. And in the meantime, the Taliban has maintained its focus, has continued to have its patrons in the region. Pakistan has continued its support despite Pakistan's efforts to also push a peace process. So there's been political stagnation. Economically, the country has not improved, and so you have high unemployment and just a lot of difficulty in the country. So
Yeah.
So
let me actually, so let me just jump in and ask you something. I mean, so look, I mean, you've been talking about the state of the Afghan national security forces, of course, the continued difficult state of politics in the country. Meanwhile, the Taliban, I mean, the Taliban has gone through a period of change. I mean, certainly with multiple changes in leadership, now with a bit of stability, a bit of uncertainty after Mullah Omar's death, which of course happened in this period, or at least became known to have happened in this period. There was a bit of uncertainty around exactly when he died. But let me ask you, I mean, so, a lot of the, when President Biden announced the withdrawal. I mean, so first of all, we can sort of go back and talk a bit about Biden's experience as vice president, particularly when the decision-making leading up to the surge was happening. Biden was the notable dissenter in the White House. And I think that sort of left a deep mark on how he thinks about Afghanistan. I mean, he sort of is deeply skeptical of first of all, 4 stars in uniform telling him what needs to be done in Afghanistan. He, I mean, a lot of the reporting recently very clearly indicated that Biden really, he's the president of the United States. He's the commander in chief. He was not swayed by the military advice that he was given on why the United States needs to stay in Afghanistan. And a lot of that, I think, does go back to 2011 and earlier. But so now, I mean, a lot of the critiques of Biden, in many ways, I mean, this used to be, I guess, a more original talking point. Now it's less so. Reminds one, and I think recently we had an author make this point of The Diplomat, that, it really reminds one of the debates that were happening about Vietnam in 72, 73. And so, that sort of has raised this concern that the United States is going to pull out, and all of the things you just highlighted, the weak state of the economy, the Taliban getting their act together, gaining more territory, the state of politics in Afghanistan, the state of the national army and security forces, all of this is eventually and inevitably going to lead to a fall of Saigon-style moment when we eventually see the Taliban pursue what's really been their objective for the last 20 years, which is to return to political primacy in the country. I mean, just from where you're sitting and given your experience and given your assessments of the economy, the security situation, how worried are you about that kind of a situation really playing out in 2023, 2024, let's say?
So I think there's a very reasonable likelihood of that, but I've kind of felt that was the trajectory for some time. And I come back to my sort of simplistic analogy of the tire, and that the Taliban, as you noted, has had had some bumps in the road, but has still remained generally cohesive enough, and frankly, highly motivated. And that's been one of the differences all along between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and then the sort of peripheral elite and power brokers outside of the government. Is they've never really circled their wagons to a point where they came to a unified anti-Taliban position, an agreement to work together for the good of the country. And they've just continued to splinter, look for opportunities for individual power, enrichment, and so I've felt all along that that's been the key problem, is that for all the U.S. and the international community has done, and despite a lot of things done wrong and a lot of mistakes, it has done a lot of good things in trying to develop and advance Afghanistan. But the Afghan elite and the Afghan government have not really embraced and internalized that. And that has given the Taliban an upper hand, where they know what they want. They've known what they've wanted for a long time. They're very focused on that, and they work militarily, politically towards that. And the Afghan elite side just hasn't come to a position that says, this is our vision of Afghanistan, and we are going to stand together and fight for it, and we are all up against the Taliban. And so, the Taliban is currently looking around to co-opt Afghan power brokers, and looking at what deals it can cut, ways it can sway people to pick them off and further divide the Afghan establishment. So, I think there's rightfully a lot of criticism about U.S. policy in Afghanistan for a long time. I think, to me, the biggest failure has been the failure to recognize the realities on the ground there, and these conditions, and the fact that you don't have a cohesive Afghan government and political elite that are willing to put divisions aside for the greater good of not having the Taliban come back into power. So it's been said by diplomats and military officials over there, is that we can't want it more than they do. And so, and until and unless the Afghan elite, and that includes the people in control of the security forces, who are part of the political will to keep the security forces fighting and motivated, if they're not going to come together, the international community can't force this to happen unless it wants to send in a couple 100,000 troops and really bring the Taliban to its knees. So we know that's not going to happen. And so, to me, the trajectory has been set. It's just kind of a question of the glide path. And obviously a withdrawal will, I think, hasten some of that glide path. And the piece of it that remains to be seen, and kind of the potential silver lining to what I've been talking about, is if this moment does push the Afghan elite to say, hey, they really are leaving. We really do have to do this ourselves at this point. And that they do start to gel together and put some divisions aside and say, if we sit here and bicker with each other, or look for individual opportunities to gain, power, influence, money, it's all going to benefit the Taliban. So that, to me, is the last piece of this, where there's potential for them to rally and to make a difference. But I just think that the conditions in Afghanistan have always been kind of tilted in the favor of the Taliban.
Yeah.
And I think that's been challenged. That I think the previous administration started to recognize that by changing U.S. policy, to finally start negotiating directly with the Taliban and look for a way to find a softer landing to this whole thing.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about the February 2020 Doha Agreement, but we did a recent podcast on that, and I think listeners are sort of familiar with how that went, and of course, the more pertinent reality today is the Biden administration's decision. It's not just about what's happening inside Afghanistan. Of course, I agree with you that that is a big part of the picture here, but you said it yourself that Afghanistan, it has been a playground for great powers in the Asian heartland for a long time. Part of, I think, the Biden administration's case, at least this is part of the story the administration is telling itself, is that U.S. withdrawal will ultimately force countries like India, China, Russia, Iran, to a certain extent, to take a more active interest in Afghan security. You'll notice I didn't mention Pakistan there because Pakistan obviously does have a different set of interests there. But maybe before we close out today, you could say a little bit more about your assessment of really how you expect these other powers that do have serious equities in Afghanistan, for better or worse, how they're likely to approach the country after U.S. withdrawal.
Sure, we've certainly seen indications of that over the last year. China in particular has taken a more active interest in trying to facilitate, peace process. Pakistan, yes, it has put more pressure on the Taliban to negotiate. I think I sort of look at it through what are their common interests. So all of the regional countries do have a shared interest in that an unstable Afghanistan where terrorists are present and operating doesn't benefit any of them. So first and foremost, they can all agree on the fact that they do not want a terrorist haven in their backyard. So you start from there. At least they can all agree on that. Beyond that, there are some other common interests. Ideally, countries in the region would like to see stability so that there can be infrastructure developed that benefits countries there to move things more easily, to have more port access. You have the desire by all of them to prevent a refugee exodus from Afghanistan. And that affects, primarily Iran and Pakistan. There's some things to work with. And Iran in particular does have some strong and historic ties. And this is something back in 2012, I did some reporting on this sort of awkward triangular relationship between Iran, Afghanistan, and the United States. And so you have the situation where Iran and the United States have been adversarial for a long time. It's had peaks and valleys, but generally, they've been in a position where they could not work together over Afghanistan and look at common interests and see how Iran could increase investments in energy and economic aspects. But Iran has an interest in doing that. Historically, Iran was anti-Taliban. They have gradually started to hedge and realize that, number one, the Taliban will be a piece of Afghanistan going forward. It's a question of how big. And number two, obviously, Iran started to hedge to poke the U.S. in the eye in Afghanistan. Iran can certainly do some things in terms of investing and supporting Afghanistan that can be positive. China certainly wants stability. It wants a country where there is some potential economic gain. It certainly wants to contain things to prevent anything that motivates any groups in China that the Chinese government is concerned about, obviously in the west of the country, and the Uyghurs. China does not want to see anything that would support that, would be a demonstration effect, or would give any haven for Central Asian militants. Pakistan and India are sort of comes back to them as the tough nuts in this. And, Pakistan still desire for strategic depth in Afghanistan, which has been a problem because India certainly has played a positive role in terms of development and investment. But as India gains, that creates angst in Pakistan, and then that creates different actions. And so, Pakistan wants really a compliant regime in Afghanistan and wants minimal Indian presence and investment there. So that's one where there really are, I think, some clashes between regional powers. I don't think Iran, Russia, China really have any areas that they clash in Afghanistan. How this is all going to play out, it does in large part hinge on how active U.S. diplomacy remains in Afghanistan and the extent to which the U.S. does continue to push and does look for opportunities to start convening some of the regional powers and look for opportunities to cooperate, collaborate, and manage a transition.
Right.
If there's a vacuum, then all bets are off. But I do think that the Biden administration is cognizant of these factors and is looking at this. And Secretary Blinken has made comments to this effect about maintaining robust diplomacy and investment. So this isn't simply a redo of the Soviets in the 80s, but that there will be continued investment and efforts to look at who in the region can bring positive things to bear to promote stability in Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the points I'd echo is that I think a lot will really come down to how effectively the United States is able to diplomatically interact. I mean, not only with the Pakistani government, but really weigh on the decision-making that Pakistan's military intelligence complex will actually make different decisions about Afghanistan. I'm not too optimistic personally about that, but that I think certainly will be a part of the post-withdrawal landscape here. Anyway, Sean, so we are unfortunately at the end of our time, but I really do want to thank you for coming on today and sharing your experiences and your insight on Afghanistan and Afghanistan's future. Thanks a lot for taking the time today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
All right. Thanks a lot. For listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. You can do that at any place you get your podcast. It really helps get the word out about the show and helps us expand. And as always, if you have suggestions for future episodes, please do feel free to either tweet at me or email me. I'm very happy to take those into consideration. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'll be back soon with more.